January 12, 1943. Rassenburg, East Prussia. A low sun cuts through the pine forest surrounding the Wolfschanz headquarters, throwing long shadows across the frozen compound. Inside a dimly lit briefing room, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cold iron from damp greatcoats drying near the stove. German staff officers crowd around a reconnaissance report just delivered from the Eastern Front. Typed lines describe something they can scarcely believe. American factories, once building sedans and farm tractors, are now producing tanks at a rhythm no European nation can match. Trainloads of newly assembled M4 Shermans are reported crossing U.S. rail lines every hour. Another sheet details output from the Detroit tank arsenal, an industrial complex the size of a small city, operating night and day. No battlefield maneuver, no armored thrust, no tactical counterstroke can account for the sheer volume of machines now entering Allied service. One officer mutters that destroying 10 tanks today means facing 20 tomorrow. Another notes that even Germany's most modern Panthers cannot survive a war of replacement. For the first time, the room falls silent, not from strategy, but from recognition of what lies ahead. A reality that began long before 1943, but the fear settling over that briefing room in East Prussia did not emerge overnight. It was a result of a transformation that began years earlier, quietly at first, then with a speed and scale unmatched in modern history. To understand why Axis commanders grew more alarmed by American tank production than by any battlefield maneuver, we must return to the early years of the war, when the United States still stood formally outside the conflict but was already awakening its industrial might. In 1940, America was a nation of machines. Its cities hummed with the rhythm of automobile plants, steel mills, and assembly lines stretching farther than any in Europe or Asia. Ford's River Rouge plant alone employed more workers than many German towns had citizens. More importantly, the U.S. manufacturing model was built on an idea Europe had never embraced fully: standardization. Parts that were interchangeable, assembly processes that were repeatable, machines that could be built by the thousands, not in artisan workshops, but on mile-long production floors. To Axis intelligence officers watching from afar, this industrial landscape mattered, but they misread its meaning. Germany believed the U.S. was too slow, too inexperienced in military production, too accustomed to consumer goods. Japan believed America lacked the national cohesion to convert peacetime comfort into wartime sacrifice. Even within Washington, many doubted whether the country could pivot toward heavy armaments fast enough to matter. Then came a shock. December 1940, the arsenal of democracy speech. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared that the United States would not merely arm itself. It would become the supplier of the free world. The promise was enormous, and many, especially in Berlin, dismissed it as rhetoric. Yet within months, automobile companies began retooling their plants. Tool and die shops expanded their shifts. Steelworks took on new contracts. A cascade of industrial energy, not yet fully understood abroad, had been set in motion. Still, in 1940 and early 1941, few outside America realized what was happening. U.S. tank production was tiny, hundreds per year compared to Germany's thousands. But the architecture of mass production was forming: belts, presses, furnaces, transportation grids, and the managerial systems to coordinate them. Everything would accelerate after June 1941, when German forces surged into the Soviet Union. The U.S. watched this offensive closely. Observers noted the massive tank losses inflicted on both sides and the pace at which mechanized warfare was consuming machines. If the Allies were to survive, they would need numbers, not incremental increases, but industrial surges powerful enough to overcome the Axis before its conquest became permanent. By the time America entered the war in December 1941, the blueprint for colossal armored output was already in place. Factories that once built cars would build tanks. Workers who once shaped chrome bumpers would shape armor plates. and management teams accustomed to producing thousands of vehicles per week would apply that same rhythm to machines built for war. For Germany and Japan, this shift remained largely theoretical through 1942. Intelligence estimates lagged behind reality. Reports arriving in Berlin suggested growing U.S. output, but not the scale or speed that truly existed. Axis planners still believed they had time, that their own tank models, their battlefield experience, and their tactical doctrines could offset whatever America produced. But the numbers were rising faster than anyone anticipated. By late 1942, the first waves of American tanks began appearing in North Africa. They were not perfect. Some were outgunned or thinly armored. Yet what captured German attention was not the individual tank, but the rate at which new ones kept arriving. Supply ships unloaded fresh vehicles even before older ones had been lost. Maintenance crews received crates of spare parts that fit flawlessly, something German units could rarely claim. And as the months passed, a realization formed on the Eastern Front, in the Mediterranean, and in Berlin's war rooms alike. America was not producing tanks the way other nations did. It was producing them with the speed, discipline, and scale of a continent-sized factory, one that had only just begun to accelerate. This momentum would reshape the war entirely. The rapid expansion of American tank production was not merely an industrial achievement. It was a strategic shock that rippled outward across every theater of war. To understand why Axis commanders feared it more than any battlefield maneuver, we must examine the structural imbalance unfolding beneath the surface. By early 1943, Germany was fighting three wars at once. One against the Soviet Union's colossal manpower reserves, another against the British Empire's global footprint, and now a third against the industrial weight of the United States. Even with its formidable engineering tradition, Germany could not match all three fronts simultaneously. The heart of the imbalance was steel. Germany struggled to produce enough of it, dividing limited capacity between submarines, artillery, aircraft, and tanks. Japan faced an even harsher constraint, importing much of its steel before the war and losing access to vital supply routes as the conflict expanded. In both empires, every tank built required trade-offs. Fewer aircraft, fewer ships, fewer artillery guns, fewer locomotives for the Eastern Front. The United States faced no such limits. Its internal railways connected vast mines in Minnesota to Midwestern steel mills and then to Detroit's industrial plants, or moved by the ton, steel by the mile, components by the trainload. This ability to sustain long-term mechanized warfare without sacrificing other branches of the military would define the conflict. Germany attempted to counter this by focusing on superior tank design. The Panther and Tiger emerged as formidable machines, their armor thick, their guns lethal. But such engineering demanded time, precision, and scarce materials. A Tiger tank required more than 300,000 man-hours to produce. A Sherman required a fraction of that. German factories turn out dozens per month. American factories produced hundreds. By late 1942, the gap began widening into something irreversible. The U.S. had standardized its tank production process to an extent unimaginable in Europe. Assembly lines rolled continuously, supported by networks of subcontractors who could deliver engines, gearboxes, tracks, and turrets with clockwork predictability. There was no equivalent in Berlin or Tokyo, no industrial ecosystem capable of replacing tanks as fast as they were lost. And the war itself was accelerating. Each front demanded more armored vehicles than the one before it. North Africa consumed tanks in high heat, long marches, and mechanical strain. The Eastern Front devoured them through attrition, mud, cold, and a relentless cycle of offensives and counteroffensives. In the Pacific, while tanks played a lesser role, American factories still churned them out because the global strategic picture required overwhelming reserves. This reality became undeniable when Axis intelligence officers began comparing battlefield reports. American forces were not just receiving reinforcements, they were over-receiving them. Grant's, Stuart's, then Sherman's, arriving in waves that exceeded immediate operational need. These surplus tanks formed reserve pools, training fleets, and logistical backfills that ensured any front could be reinforced at will. Germany, by contrast, often struggled to replace losses from a single major engagement. Panzer divisions listed as armored frequently operated with a fraction of their authorized tanks. Panther units assigned to the Eastern Front arrived under strength even before reaching the battlefield. Japanese armored forces, built around lighter tanks, could not hope to match the American surge at all. From Berlin's perspective, the most frightening development was this. The United States was expanding production even faster than its early success suggested. By mid-1943, new plants at Grand Blanc, Lima, and Warren were running at full capacity. A country that had built a few hundred tanks in 1940 was now producing thousands. And unlike Europe, its factories were safe, untouched by enemy bombs, protected by vast oceans, and able to operate 24 hours a day. The strategic implications were enormous. Tank warfare, once defined by maneuver and battlefield skill, was becoming a contest of endurance. The side that could replace losses the fastest would dictate the terms of the conflict. In this emerging equation, Axis commanders began to see the truth. America's industrial strength was not supporting the war. It was defining it. And the next stage of the conflict would reveal the full weight of that advantage. The Axis fear of American tank production did not rest solely on industrial and logistical factors. It deepened as frontline officers began sending back reports describing the overwhelming material presence of U.S. armor. Their assessments, technical, tactical, and psychological, revealed a growing realization. The United States was fighting a kind of war Germany and Japan were never built to withstand. 4. Enemy perspective angle. What German and Japanese commanders saw. From 1943 onward, German field commanders noticed a pattern emerging across multiple theaters. When American tanks appeared, they did so in groups large enough to absorb losses without slowing momentum. At Kasserine, Tunisia, Sicily, Salerno, and later Normandy, situation reports often described U.S. armor arriving in waves, even when significant numbers have been destroyed in previous engagements. General Bayerlein of Panzer Lehr remarked in 1944 that defeating American forces required destroying the same unit repeatedly because replacements flowed so quickly from rear depots. German officers found themselves fighting not a static enemy, but one whose strength reset after every battle. Japanese assessments were similarly sobering. Observers noted that American armored losses in island campaigns had minimal strategic impact because the U.S. could simply send more machines from its Pacific depots. The concept of a finite American armored reserve, an idea essential to Japanese pre-war planning, proved entirely false. This enemy perspective formed one of the most important psychological angles of the war. For Axis commanders, the realization that American tank strength renewed itself automatically was profoundly destabilizing. It meant that traditional victory conditions, inflicting damage, destroying formations, exhausting the opponent, no longer applied. Warfare had shifted from annihilation to outproduction, a contest Germany and Japan were structurally incapable of winning. 5. The technological angle, reliability over perfection. The technological differences between American and German tanks are often framed as a debate between quality and quantity. But Axis commanders understood the deeper truth. Reliability, not superiority, determined sustained combat power. The M4 Sherman, the most iconic American tank of the war, was not the most heavily armored machine on the battlefield. It did not carry the largest gun, and yet, in strategic terms, it was the most fearsome tank in the conflict. Not because of what it was, but because of what it enabled. A Sherman typically required far less maintenance than a Panther or Tiger. Its engine could be repaired quickly. Its tracks could be replaced in the field. Crews could learn its systems in days, not weeks. Most importantly, spare parts were plentiful, standard, and manufactured in vast quantities. German tank battalions frequently reported that only a fraction of their Panthers or Tigers were operational at any given time, not because of combat, but because of mechanical strain. Panther transmissions were notoriously fragile, and Tiger engines overheated in long marches. These weaknesses were not merely technical inconveniences. They degraded the operational readiness of entire formations. American tanks, by contrast, showed up for battle. They started, moved, fired, and kept moving. This reliability had a strategic multiplier effect. A tank that works every day is worth more than a tank that works occasionally, no matter how powerful. German and Japanese officers knew that a handful of superior machines could never compensate for formations that always arrived at full strength. As a result, technological inferiority became a logistical disaster for the Axis, while American good-enough design philosophy proved overwhelmingly effective. 6. The moral and psychological angle. The fear of infinite replacement. Beneath the industrial, logistical, and tactical assessments lay a deeper, more human reality: morale. For German soldiers, especially from 1943 onward, every destroyed tank represented not just the loss of a vehicle, but the loss of time. Time to rebuild, time to refit, time they no longer had. Each replacement demanded scarce steel, overworked laborers, and vulnerable transport networks. American forces experienced no such hesitation. Destroy a Sherman today, and a replacement arrived within days. Lose 3 in a week, and an entire platoon might appear to fill the gap. This difference eroded the psychological balance between armies. German diaries from Normandy describe the exhaustion of fighting an enemy whose strength regenerated faster than it could be diminished. Tank aces who once believed decisive skill could shape a battle began acknowledging that the war's outcome depended less on individual combat and more on national output. For Japanese commanders, the emotional blow was even sharper. Their doctrine emphasized courage, sacrifice, and spiritual strength. Facing an enemy that could deploy machines endlessly, machines supported by vast infrastructure and modern industry, undermined the foundation of their pre-war belief system. What terrified the Axis was not that American tanks were everywhere. It was that they seemed as if they would always be everywhere. The war was becoming a contest of will measured through production, and the United States possessed a will expressed in quantities neither Germany nor Japan could match. These angles, technical, human, logistical, industrial, and psychological, set the stage for the turning point of the conflict. Soon, these forces would collide directly with Axis armored doctrine in a series of battles where production, not maneuver, determined victory. By the summer of 1944, all the forces shaping the war, America's industrial surge, its logistical precision, and the Axis struggle to maintain armored strength, were converging onto a single, bitter battlefield. Northern France had become the proving ground where theory met reality. And here, German commanders saw the full weight of American tank production in motion. August 18, 1944, 0630 hours, near the village of St. Lambert-sur-Dives. The morning fog hangs low over the fields. Smoke from burning farms mixes with the smell of diesel, cordite, and trampled earth. German units retreating from the Falaise Pocket are attempting to escape through a narrowing corridor, pushing their remaining armor westward toward the Seine. The roads are clogged with exhausted infantry, battered trucks, and tanks running short on fuel. Across the ridgeline, U.S. armored divisions are closing in. Sherman's tank destroyers, armored infantry carriers, moving with the steady momentum of a force that seems endlessly replenished. A German staff officer stationed near the pocket records a stark observation in his report. For every tank we destroy, 2 more appear. It was not hyperbole, it was arithmetic. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, the 3rd Armored Division, and elements of the 90th Infantry Division are tightening the ring. Tanks lost the previous week to mines and ambushes have already been replaced. Units mauled in hedgerow fighting now advance at nearly full strength. German reconnaissance notes the troubling truth. American armored battalions fighting in Normandy appear as intact today as they had been in July, despite weeks of attrition. This is the moment German commanders realize what their early intelligence reports had only hinted at. American industry is not simply supporting the campaign, it is driving it. At 0715 hours, near Trun, a German Panther positions itself behind the wreckage of a knocked-out tractor and opens fire. Its high-velocity 75mm gun destroys a leading Sherman in a single shot. Flames rise from the hull as the crew bails out under machine gun fire. But before the smoke clears, another 2 Shermans crest the hill, engines roaring. The Panther rotates its turret, lines up a second shot, but one Sherman keeps advancing while the other flanks left, forcing the German crew to reposition under pressure. This was the operational pattern American commanders relied on, constant pressure sustained by the certainty of reinforcement. In contrast, the Panther belongs to a company that began the Normandy campaign with over a dozen tanks and now fields fewer than 5, many suffering mechanical failures. Its replacement turrets are stuck on rail cars destroyed by Allied bombing. Its spare track links sit in a depot hundreds of kilometers away, and its supporting infantry, worn thin by weeks of fighting, can no longer protect it from encirclement. Every German tank commander knows the stakes. In the East, they had adapted to Soviet numerical superiority. But here in France, the surprise is that American forces, once dismissed as inexperienced, are applying constant, mechanized pressure at a pace Germany cannot match. At 0752 hours, the German Panther attempts to reverse into a new firing position. Its transmission grinds, sputters, and fails, one of the mechanical weaknesses that had plagued the model since its rushed introduction at Kursk. The crew's only option is to abandon the vehicle. They set the charges below the tank and retreat on foot through the orchards. Minutes later, a U.S. recovery vehicle pulls up to the burning Sherman left behind earlier. The crew, miraculously alive, climb aboard a waiting supply truck headed toward a rear repair depot. A brand new Sherman, delivered overnight from a French port, is assigned to their company before noon. By the next morning, the crew will be operational again. This was the cycle German commanders could not outpace. The battlefield in Normandy becomes a visible demonstration of American production philosophy. Destroyed tanks are hazards to clear, not strategic defeats. Damaged units regroup quickly. Entire battalions recover their strength in days rather than weeks. In the final intelligence summary written before the collapse of the Falaise Pocket, one German officer describes the situation with stark clarity. The enemy's armored reserves appear inexhaustible. The destruction of their tanks delays them only briefly. The destruction of ours halts us entirely. For the German High Command, this was the turning point. Not a single moment on a map, but the dawning realization that the war had become a contest of endurance where American tanks, ships, depots, and factories formed a chain that could not be broken. And as August 1944 drew to a close, the consequences of that imbalance were about to culminate in a decisive collapse. The collapse of the Falaise Pocket was not merely a tactical defeat. It was the moment Axis commanders saw the strategic truth they had feared since the first reports of American mass production crossed their desks. What happened in those final days of August 1944 would confirm that no battlefield maneuver, no armored counterstroke, could overcome the industrial weight now battering Germany from every direction. August 20th, 1944. 1,430 hours. The Chambois, Coudhard sector. The heat of late summer hangs over the fields. Dust clouds rise from the movement of retreating German units, their formations fragmented, their vehicles damaged, underfueled, or abandoned. Columns of men stumble along narrow country roads, hoping to escape the tightening Allied ring. American tanks move with relentless regularity, advancing from multiple axes. Shermans crest ridge lines in disciplined lines of march, each platoon backed by tank destroyers, engineers, artillery, and supply carriers. What unnerved German commanders is not the tanks themselves, but how complete the American armored force appears after weeks of continuous combat. At 1,500 hours, remnants of the German 2nd Panzer Division attempt a desperate breakout. A handful of Panthers and Panzer IVs push forward, supported by infantry trying to carve a path through the American and Polish forces blocking their route. The Germans achieve brief local success, knocking out 2 Shermans and scattering an American reconnaissance patrol. But then something the Germans had seen repeatedly in Normandy happens again. The U.S. armor keeps coming. By 15-13 hours, the Germans detect the rumble of more tanks approaching from the south. The 2nd Armored Division has rotated fresh companies into the line, vehicles that arrived only days earlier through Cherbourg. Their tracks are clean. Their engines run smooth. Their crews have scarcely tasted combat. The German officers watching from the hedgerows understand instantly what this means. American armored strength is not being worn down. It's being renewed. A German regimental commander radios his superior with a terse message. Enemy reinforcements continual. Our strength exhausted. At 1,530 hours, American artillery begins pounding the German corridor. The precision and density of fire disrupt the retreat, scattering tanks into the fields. Under this curtain of shells, Sherman units advance in staggered formations, never allowing the Germans time to regroup. Those Panthers, still operational, try to engage from hull-down positions, but the terrain offers few advantages, and the Panthers' long-barreled guns cannot compensate for the overwhelming numerical pressure bearing down on them. Once again, the core imbalance reveals itself. Each destroyed German tank is a permanent loss, an asset that will never be replaced. Each destroyed Sherman is a temporary setback, its absence filled by another vehicle already en route. By 1,600 hours, the breakout attempt has collapsed. Panthers burn in the orchards. Panzer IVs sit immobilized on the roadsides, their tracks blown off or engines seized from overheating. Supply trucks lie overturned in ditches, their cargo of ammunition scattered across the dust. Survivors retreat toward the river, but the Allied cordon is closing fast. In these final hours, American tank units perform a task rarely seen in earlier years of the war. They attack continuously without operational pause. Fuel and ammunition arrive by the truckload. Replacement tanks form queues behind forward depots. Commanders operate with a confidence built on logistical certainty, the assurance that whatever is lost today will be replenished tomorrow. The last significant German armored formation in the pocket, elements of Kampfgruppe von Luck, attempts one final disengagement under cover of darkness. But the night offers little relief. U.S. tanks have been resupplied. Fresh reconnaissance units probe the darkness. Artillery fire continues with unnerving accuracy, guided by radios and sound-ranging equipment. By dawn on August 21st, the Falaise Pocket closes. Tens of thousands of German troops are killed or captured. Hundreds of vehicles are destroyed or abandoned. Entire armored battalions cease to exist. 4 German commanders who escape eastward. The psychological blow is devastating. The fighting spirit of their crews remains strong, but the material basis of their armored doctrine has been shattered. In report after report, they describe the same pattern. American tanks were not superior in armor or firepower, yet they never stopped arriving. This was the decisive turning point of armored warfare in the West. Not a single shot or a single commander's brilliance, but the realization that the Allies, driven by American production, could sustain operations at a pace Germany could never match. From this moment onward, the strategic initiative would remain firmly in Allied hands. And as the German army reeled from the collapse in France, the consequences of that industrial imbalance began spreading across the entire front. The end of the Falaise Pocket marked more than the destruction of German forces trapped in Normandy. It signaled the irreversible collapse of the Wehrmacht's armored capability in the West. The consequences unfolded rapidly, measured not only in casualties and lost equipment, but in the psychological and strategic shock that spread through the German command structure. In the days following the encirclement, Allied intelligence teams fanned out across the battlefield, photographing the wreckage. The fields around Chambois, Tron, and St. Lambert were littered with burnt-out Panthers, overturned half-tracks, shattered artillery pieces, and thousands of abandoned trucks. For the Allies, the sight confirmed victory. For the Germans who escaped, it confirmed something far heavier, a realization that their armored arm, once the spear point of Blitzkrieg, had been broken not by superior tactics, but by exhaustion. German casualty reports from August 1944 record staggering losses. Entire regiments disappeared. Panzer divisions that had entered Normandy with 120 to 150 operational tanks now counted fewer than 15. Some divisions, like the 2nd Panzer, had essentially ceased to exist as fighting formations. And unlike the American and British armies, the Germans had no reserve pool of tanks waiting behind the lines. What was lost in Normandy could not be replaced. The German High Command issued somber assessments. General Heinz Guderian, serving as chief of the General Staff, warned Hitler that armored formations on the Eastern Front would soon be undermanned if reinforcements were diverted west. Field Marshals von Kluge and Model both highlighted the same concern in their reports. The American capacity to replenish tanks and vehicles was overwhelming German ability to sustain combat. One staff memorandum from late August summarized it plainly. The enemy's material strength grows even as ours diminishes. Their losses are compensated within days. Ours are final. This imbalance extended beyond tanks themselves. Logistical collapse. The German logistical network could not absorb the losses suffered in the pocket. Fuel depots intended for armored operations were seized or destroyed. Ammunition stores burned. Communications units were lost. Repair crews, critical for restoring damaged vehicles, were either killed or captured. The ripple effect crippled the mobility of retreating formations. When German troops withdrew eastward toward the Seine, many marched on foot. Those tanks that survived the pocket arrived with empty fuel tanks, cracked suspensions, or missing road wheels. Few were ever fully repaired. Allied air superiority made movement risky, and the Luftwaffe lacked the strength to protect supply lines. American reports on loss replacement. While German forces struggled, American units prepared for the next offensive. Logistics officers noted that losses sustained during the breakout operations were already being filled. Sherman tanks delivered from the United States in June and July were now part of frontline replacements. Others arrived through ports newly opened after the fall of Cherbourg. A U.S. Army Ordnance report from September 1944 recorded that certain armor divisions were operating at near full tank strength, despite weeks of continuous combat. This was unprecedented in the war. Normally, prolonged fighting led to depleted units. Here, the opposite was occurring. The psychological impact. For German soldiers and officers, the emotional toll was profound. Diaries recovered from the battlefield describe exhaustion, disbelief, and a growing acceptance that the war was turning irreversibly against them. One Panzer crewman wrote, "We destroy one tank, but there are always more." Where do they come from? For American crews, the mood was very different. They recognized the risks of combat. Shermans burned quickly when hit, but they trusted that replacements would always arrive, that parts would be available, and that their formation would never remain under strength for long. This confidence translated into operational momentum. Strategic shift. The destruction of the Falaise Pocket and the demonstration of American production power shifted the entire strategic situation. The German front in France collapsed. Retreat turned into retreat on a continental scale. Within weeks, Allied armies were racing toward Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually the German frontier. But the broader consequences, military, industrial, and geopolitical, were only beginning to unfold. As German forces withdrew across the Seine and attempted to consolidate a new defensive line along the borders of the Reich, the deeper consequences of America's armored production surge began to reshape the war at every level. The aftermath of the Normandy campaign was not confined to Europe. Its meaning extended into doctrine, global strategy, and the post-war world that was already taking shape. The end of German armored dominance. The Wehrmacht's experiences in France confirmed a harsh truth. The age of fast, decisive armored breakthroughs, once the signature of German warfare, was over. The Panzerwaffe could no longer generate the mass or cohesion needed to form an operational spearhead. Every new tank pushed off a German assembly line was immediately absorbed into defensive actions, not held for concentrated offensives. This shift forced German planners to abandon the idea of regaining the initiative. From late 1944 onward, the armored arm existed largely to delay, to counterpunch, and to slow Allied advance, not to shape the battlefield. The dream of a second blitzkrieg died in the smoke of the Falaise Pocket, a permanent imbalance in industrial warfare. But the implications stretched beyond Germany. Observers across the world took note. Industrial capacity, measured in standardized production, supply networks, and replacement rates, was the decisive weapon of modern war. Soviet commanders had already embraced this principle, but American production elevated it to a new level. The United States had demonstrated that a nation could mobilize millions of workers, coordinate thousands of factories, and produce machines faster than they could be destroyed. This realization guided how future superpowers assessed military strength. After 1945, nations understood that the quality of a single tank mattered far less than the systems that produced and supported it. Doctrine, training, maintenance, parts interchangeability, rail capacity, port capacity, these became the essential metrics of power. Allied doctrines transform. America's success in Normandy reshaped its own thinking as well. The U.S. Army recognized that tanks did not need to be the heaviest or most technically advanced to dominate a battlefield. They only needed to be reliable, easy to maintain, available in overwhelming numbers, supported by a vast logistical machine. This lesson influenced post-war American doctrine, leading to the development of armored forces built around mass production principles and global supply chains. The British, witnessing the same events, adjusted their approach too. They increased emphasis on integrated armored formations and standardized equipment, a departure from the scatter of tank types used earlier in the war. Soviet calculations for the future. In Moscow, Soviet strategists studied American industrial performance with great interest. They recognized that the United States, unlike Germany, could fight a long war of attrition. While the Soviet Union had depended on enormous manpower reserves and its own huge tank production, it also relied heavily on American Lend-Lease support, which provided vehicles, machinery, and raw materials that sustained its industrial base. After the war, these insights shaped Soviet Cold War planning. If future conflicts mirrored the scale of the Second World War, victory would depend on production and logistics even more than on tactical brilliance. The Red Army would grow into a massive, industrially supported force, one capable of fighting at scale for years. The Axis industrial lesson. The collapse of Germany's armor in Normandy revealed the core error of Axis strategic planning. Both Germany and Japan entered the war with industries unable to support prolonged mechanized conflict. They relied on early victories, assumed short campaigns, and expected their enemies to negotiate. American tank production proved how dangerous those assumptions were. In a war of machines, the side that can replace its losses faster determines the outcome, setting the stage for post-war power. The United States emerged from Normandy not only with a battlefield victory, but with a new global identity. Its ability to mobilize industry on a continental scale positioned it as the engine of the emerging international order. The factories that built tanks in Detroit, Cleveland, and Pennsylvania would soon build tractors, cars, aircraft, and the machinery that reconstructed Europe and Japan. America's industrial ascendancy had begun as a wartime necessity. It ended as the foundation of a post-war superpower. The war was not yet over. Bitter fighting remained in the Ardennes, the Rhineland, and across the Pacific, but the strategic direction was now irreversible. The United States had demonstrated that its power came not only from its soldiers and commanders, but from the vast industrial arteries that fed its armies. And that reality carried lessons deeper than any battlefield victory. The story of American tank production in the Second World War is often told in numbers. How many Shermans rolled off assembly lines? How many engines were built? How many ships carried them across oceans? But the deeper truth lies not in the statistics, but in what those numbers revealed about the nature of modern war. Germany and Japan entered the conflict believing battlefield maneuver, tactical brilliance, and superior engineering would determine victory. Their early successes seemed to confirm this. But as the war expanded, it evolved into something far larger, a contest of endurance fought across oceans, continents, and industrial landscapes. The battlefield became only one part of a wider struggle. What American tank production demonstrated was that modern warfare could no longer be won by the strength of individual machines or the skill of individual commanders. Victory belonged to the nation that could sustain pressure, absorb losses, and replace what was destroyed. In this new reality, factories became as decisive as divisions, supply lines as important as combat formations. For Axis commanders, the realization arrived slowly, then all at once. Each Sherman rolling off a cargo ship represented more than a vehicle. It represented an industrial system working day and night, untouched by bombs, supported by millions of workers, connected by railroads stretching thousands of miles. A single tank was not a threat. 1,000 tanks, replaced as quickly as they were lost, became a force no maneuver could outflank. The collapse of German armor in Normandy was not simply a military defeat. It was the moment the industrial balance of the war became undeniable. After that summer, the war's direction was clear. No counterattack, no new weapon, no tactical surprise could alter the strategic truth taking shape. In the end, America's tanks were powerful not because they were perfect, but because they arrived relentlessly. And in that steady rhythm of production, the post-war world was already beginning, one defined by the idea that the strength of a nation rests not only on its armies, but on the vast machinery that sustains them.